Courtroom chaos. Judge orders Pam Bondi to jail, then takes it back just moments later. What explosive evidence changed everything? Witness justice in action. The federal courthouse in San Francisco fell silent as Judge Edward Chen's laughter echoed through the wood-paneled chamber. His normally composed judicial demeanor had cracked open into undisguised amusement at the argument just presented by former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. The 150 spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Journalists leaned forward, and Bondi's face flushed deep crimson. "Miss Bondi," Judge Chen said, regaining his composure but with a smile still playing at the corners of his mouth, "in my 20 years on the federal bench, I've never heard such a creative interpretation of constitutional law." The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Bondi stood frozen at the podium, her knuckles whitening as she gripped its edges. This high-profile tech regulation case had drawn national attention, but no one expected the respected Obama-appointed judge to openly mock a former state attorney general with deep political connections. For a moment, Bondi's expression was unreadable. Then something changed in her eyes, a flash of determination that silenced the room. What happened in the next 4 minutes would stun the legal world, transform the case, and potentially reshape the relationship between government and America's tech giants forever. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary courtroom showdown, make sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss our latest breaking political stories. This confrontation between Judge Chen and Pam Bondi is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. Judge Edward Chen, the 70-year-old federal judge for the Northern District of California, had built his reputation on meticulous legal reasoning, an unflappable calm appointed by President Obama in 2011. After serving as a magistrate judge, Chen was the first Asian-American judge appointed to the Northern District. Known for his sharp questioning and tech-savvy approach to complex cases, he had presided over several landmark decisions affecting Silicon Valley. Opposing him stood Pam Bondi, the 56-year-old former Florida Attorney General who had transitioned into private practice representing corporate clients. With her trademark blonde hair and telegenic presence, Bondi had built a national profile through frequent cable news appearances and her work with the previous administration. She had been hired by the Tech Freedom Coalition, a group of mid-sized technology companies, to challenge new federal regulations that would impose strict transparency requirements on algorithmic decision-making. The case: Tech Freedom Coalition. The Department of Commerce had reached Judge Chen's courtroom. After months of heated public debate, the Biden administration had implemented rules requiring companies to disclose how their algorithms collected and used personal data, particularly when making decisions affecting credit, housing, and employment opportunities. For the tech companies, the regulations threatened proprietary algorithms they claimed were essential to their competitive advantage for privacy advocates and consumer protection groups. The rules represented a vital step toward algorithmic accountability after years of unchecked data. Harvesting the stakes extended far beyond this single case. If Judge Chen upheld the regulations, it would set a precedent for government oversight of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. If Bondi prevailed, it would reinforce the tech industry's ability to operate with minimal transparency. The courtroom was packed with tech executives, privacy advocates, and media figures. Representatives from Google, Meta, and Apple watched intently from the gallery. Despite not being direct parties to the case, their presence underscored the industry-wide implications of the proceedings. Chen had developed a reputation for asking technically sophisticated questions that sometimes exposed attorneys' limited understanding of the technologies they defended. Bondi, despite her high profile, had little experience litigating complex tech cases, leading many observers to question the coalition's strategy in selecting her as lead counsel. As the afternoon session began, Bondi had launched into an argument comparing algorithmic code to protected speech under the First Amendment, a legal theory that had been attempted but rarely succeeded in previous cases. It was this novel interpretation that had prompted Judge Chen's unexpected laughter, creating the tense moment that now hung in the air. Judge Chen's laughter lingered in the courtroom as Pam Bondi stood silently at the podium. The tension was palpable as spectators watched for her response. Would she retreat, regroup, or lash out? Instead, she did something no one anticipated. "Your Honor," Bondi began, her voice steady, despite the flush still visible on her face. "I appreciate that my argument might seem unconventional, but if I may, I'd like to approach the bench with evidence that hasn't yet been submitted to the court." Chen raised an eyebrow, his amusement giving way to curiosity. "This is highly irregular, Ms. Bondi. We're well into oral arguments, I understand, Your Honor, but what I have will directly address the court's apparent skepticism." Her confidence was returning, her posture straightening, as she held up a flash drive. Government attorneys at the opposing table exchanged concerned glances. "Your Honor, we object to any new evidence at this stage," said Martin Cohen, the lead Department of Commerce attorney. The discovery period closed months ago. Judge Chen studied Bondi for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow you to approach Miss Bondi, but be advised that if this is merely a theatrical tactic, I won't be amused twice today." As Bondi walked toward the bench, whispers rippled through the gallery. Legal analysts would later debate whether Chen's decision to allow this procedural irregularity was driven by curiosity, a desire to appear fair after his laughter, or simple interest in what Bondi might produce. Bondi handed the flash drive to the judge's clerk and spoke quietly enough that only Chen and the nearby court reporter could hear. The judge's expression changed from skepticism to surprise, then concealed any reaction behind his judicial poker face. He nodded once, and Bondi returned to the podium. "Your Honor, I request a 30-minute recess for the court to review this material and for the government attorneys to do the same. After that, I believe the relevance to our First Amendment argument will be clear." Chen studied her for a moment, then announced, "The court will take a 30-minute recess. Government counsel will review the submitted materials in the conference room. We'll reconvene at 2:45 p.m. sharp." His gavel cracked against the sound block, and he disappeared into his chambers. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Journalists worked their sources, trying to discover what Bondi had presented. Tech executives huddled with their attorneys in the hallway, visibly concerned about this unexpected development. When Martin Cohen emerged from reviewing the documents, his previously confident demeanor had vanished. He immediately called for a private conference with his Department of Commerce team through the glass conference room door. Observers could see intense conversation and consternation as the recess neared its end. Something extraordinary happened. Additional government attorneys began arriving at the courthouse, including two recognizable figures from the Department of Justice. Their urgent entrance fueled a new wave of speculation. Whatever Bondi had presented was significant enough to summon reinforcements from the highest levels of government at precisely 2:45 p.m. Judge Chen returned to the bench. His earlier amusement had been replaced by a gravity that silenced the room instantly. "Before we continue with arguments, I need to address the materials Ms. Bondi has submitted." Chen began. "These documents appear to contain evidence that the Department of Commerce worked directly with certain large technology companies to craft regulations that would disproportionately burden their smaller competitors, the very clients Ms. Bondi represents." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Cohen stood immediately. "Your Honor, we strongly contest the authenticity and characterization of these documents and request time to investigate their provenance." "That's a concerning response, Mr. Cohen, given that many of these communications appear to have come from your department's own servers." Chen replied, his voice sharp. "But Ms. Bondi, I must ask, how did your clients obtain these internal government communications, which include emails that were clearly not provided during discovery?" All eyes turned to Bondi, who now stood with renewed confidence. "Your Honor, a whistleblower within the Department of Commerce provided these documents to my client. Last week, the individual was directly involved in meetings where senior officials explicitly discussed using these regulations to create barriers to entry for smaller firms while exempting the larger companies through technical loopholes." The tension in the courtroom ratcheted higher. Judge Chen, whose earlier laughter at Bondi now seemed a distant memory, leaned forward. "Miss Bondi, are you prepared to call this whistleblower as a witness? They are waiting outside this courtroom, Your Honor." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Chen banged his gavel sharply. "Order, this case has clearly taken an unexpected turn. We will need to address these serious allegations before proceeding further with the constitutional arguments." Chen turned to the government table where Cohen was frantically conferring with his colleagues. Mr. Cohen, the court expects a thorough explanation. Ms. Bondi's evidence suggests potential regulatory capture and anti-competitive collusion, which, if true, would fundamentally alter the legal analysis. In this case, Cohen rose slowly. Your Honor, we request a 1-week continuance to investigate these claims and prepare a response given the seriousness of these allegations. I'll grant a 3-day continuance, Chen replied, but I want the whistleblower's testimony taken under oath and sealed before the end of today's session. Both parties will remain and will reconvene in my chambers in 30 minutes. As Chen exited the bench, the courtroom exploded into activity. The judge who had laughed at Pam Bondi less than an hour earlier was now treating her evidence with the utmost seriousness, completely reversing the power dynamic that had defined the case. Until this moment, 3 days later, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. News of the whistleblower's sealed testimony had leaked to major publications. Though the specific contents remained confidential, technology stocks had fluctuated wildly amid speculation about collusion between big tech companies and government regulators. Judge Chen entered the courtroom with a stern expression. The casual observers who had witnessed his laughter at Bondi days earlier would hardly recognize the gravity he now displayed. Before we begin, Chen announced, I want to address the leaks to the press about these proceedings. The court takes confidentiality violations extremely seriously, and I have authorized an investigation into the source of these leaks. The gallery fell silent. Chen continued, now to the matter at hand. The Department of Commerce has filed a response to Ms. Bondi's evidence. Mr. Cohen, you may present your position. Martin Cohen rose, but it was immediately apparent that something had changed. 3 new attorneys flanked him, including the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. This extraordinary presence signaled the case had escalated to the highest levels of government, Your Honor. Cohen began, his voice lacking its previous confidence. After thorough review of the documents presented by Mrs. Bondi and questioning of department personnel, we have been unable to dispute the authenticity of the communications. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. No one had expected the government to concede so quickly. However, Cohen continued, we maintain that these communications have been taken out of context and do not reflect official department policy. Certain employees may have had inappropriate discussions with technology companies, but these discussions did not ultimately influence the final regulations. Judge Chen's expression revealed nothing. And what about the whistleblower's testimony that senior officials explicitly discussed creating regulatory barriers for smaller companies? Cohen cleared his throat. We acknowledge that concerning conversations occurred, but if I may, Your Honor, the Deputy Attorney General interrupted, standing, the Department of Justice has initiated an internal investigation into potential ethics violations related to the drafting of these regulations. We take these allegations extremely seriously. This was an extraordinary development. The Department of Justice was effectively undercutting the Department of Commerce's position in open court. Judge Chen nodded. Thank you for that clarification, Miss Bondi. Your response? Pam Bondi rose, transformed from the flustered attorney who had faced judicial mockery days earlier. Now she stood as a legal crusader who had exposed potential government corruption. Your Honor, the government's response is inadequate and contradicted by their own documents. The whistleblower's testimony confirms that these weren't isolated communications, but part of a systematic effort to craft regulations that would cement the dominance of established tech giants while strangling innovation from smaller competitors. Bondi held up a document. This email from the Commerce Department's Deputy Secretary to the CEO of tech giant specifically states, and I quote, We've adjusted Section 4.3 as discussed. This should give you the runway you need while making compliance much more resource-intensive for the smaller players. Judge Chen frowned. Mr. Cohen, how do you explain this communication? Cohen hesitated. Your Honor, we cannot defend this specific exchange. The individual who sent this email has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Bondi pressed her advantage, Your Honor. This isn't about one email or one official. The evidence shows at least 27 instances where regulations were specifically modified at the request of dominant market players to disadvantage their competitors. My clients. She gestured to the crowded gallery where tech executives from both sides watched intently. This case began as a challenge to regulations we believed were unduly burdensome. It has revealed itself to be something far more troubling, a textbook example of regulatory capture and anti-competitive collusion. Judge Chen nodded slowly. I agree that the evidence presents serious concerns. The purpose of these regulations was ostensibly to protect consumers and ensure algorithmic transparency. If they were instead weaponized to protect market incumbents, that would be a perversion of regulatory authority. He turned to the government table. Mr. Cohen, in light of these revelations, what is the government's position on the enforcement of these regulations going forward? The moment hung in the air. The regulations' future and potentially the government's approach to tech oversight broadly waited on Cohen's answer. The Deputy Attorney General rose again. Your Honor, in light of the serious allegations and preliminary evidence, the Justice Department recommends a stay on enforcement of these regulations, pending a complete investigation and potential redrafting to ensure they serve their intended purpose without unfairly disadvantaging smaller market participants. This was a stunning concession. The government was effectively abandoning regulations that had been years in the making. Judge Chen nodded. Very well. I am issuing an immediate injunction, preventing enforcement of the algorithm transparency regulations, pending further proceedings. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for investigation into potential criminal violations regarding the regulatory drafting process. He turned to Bondi. Ms. Bondi, while your original First Amendment argument may have amused me, perhaps unfairly, you have done this court and the public a service by bringing this evidence forward. The integrity of the regulatory process is fundamental to our system of governance. Pam Bondi, who had endured judicial laughter just days earlier, now stood vindicated before the court and the national media, documenting every moment. Thank you, Your Honor. My clients seek only a fair regulatory environment where innovation can flourish without unfair advantage to the largest players. As Judge Chen adjourned the proceedings, the courtroom erupted in conversation. The woman who had been laughed at by a federal judge had not only recovered, but had exposed what appeared to be significant corruption in the regulatory process. The tech world and the political landscape would never be the same. The aftershocks of what quickly became known as the Chen Bondi hearing spread through Washington, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street with unprecedented speed. Within hours of Judge Chen's ruling, stocks of the major tech companies implicated in the collusion dropped sharply, while shares of smaller tech firms, including those represented by R. Bondi, surged. CNN's breaking news banner ran continuously. Judge halts tech regulations after former Florida egg exposee's alleged collusion between government and big tech. Pam Bondi emerged from the courthouse to a swarm of reporters standing poised in a navy blue suit. She addressed the cameras with measured confidence. Today's ruling isn't about partisan politics, or even about technology specifically. It's about ensuring that government regulations serve the public interest, not private interests. When I was Attorney General of Florida, I fought against corruption wherever I found it. That commitment hasn't changed. The clip of her statement played on repeat across news networks, often juxtaposed with courtroom sketches of Judge Chen laughing at her earlier arguments. The visual narrative was powerful. A woman mocked by a male authority figure who then produced evidence so compelling it transformed the case entirely. Judge Edward Chen left the courthouse through a private exit. Declining interview requests, his chambers issued a brief statement. Judge Chen believes the judicial process worked as intended. Today, evidence was presented, evaluated, and acted upon according to law. The court will have no further comment while investigations are ongoing. Inside the Department of Commerce, chaos erupted. Secretary Raymond Morris called an emergency meeting with senior staff demanding to know how such collusion could have occurred. Under his watch, 3 senior officials resigned by the end of the day. Internal emails warned employees against deleting any communications as federal investigators would soon arrive at the White House press secretary. Julia Martinez faced relentless questioning about the administration's knowledge of the alleged collusion. The president is deeply concerned by these allegations and fully supports the investigations announced by the Department of Justice and Judge Chen if regulations were compromised. By improper influence, those responsible will be held accountable regardless of position. The whistleblower, whose identity remained sealed by court order, was placed under federal protection after receiving threats. Rumors circulated that multiple technology employees were now coming forward with additional evidence of regulatory manipulation across other agencies. In Silicon Valley, the exposed companies entered crisis mode. Tech giant CEO Maxwell Warren issued a statement denying improper influence. "We regularly engage with government officials to provide industry expertise on complex technical matters. These interactions were always intended to create workable regulations, not to disadvantage competitors." The statement was met with immediate skepticism. Smaller tech companies expressed vindication. "We've been saying for years that the regulatory deck was stacked against us," said Sarah Lau, CEO of Algorithm Innovations, one of the plaintiffs represented by Bondi. "Now we have proof this isn't just about one regulation, it's about systematic favoritism that has shaped the entire industry." The media narrative quickly coalesced around Bondi's remarkable courtroom turnaround. The Washington Post ran a profile titled "From Mockery to Vindication." How Pam Bondi exposed the tech government complex. Conservative outlets celebrated her as a warrior against the deep state, while progressive publications focused on the corrupting influence of corporate power in regulation. Legal experts debated Chen's initial laughter and subsequent handling of the case. Harvard law professor Noah Feldman commented on CNN, "Judge Chen's willingness to completely reverse his position when presented with compelling evidence shows judicial humility at its best. The initial laughter was inappropriate, but his subsequent actions demonstrate integrity." Congressional hearings were announced within 48 hours. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Josh Hawley, political opposites, jointly called for a bipartisan investigation. "This isn't about left or right," Hawley stated. "It's about powerful interests corrupting our government. Americans deserve to know how deep this goes." Transparency advocates seized the moment to push for broader reforms. "This case exposes the broken regulatory process," said Mariana Rodriguez, executive director of Digital Democracy Watch. "When regulations are written, the public deserves to see who influenced them, what changes were made at whose request, and why Wall Street analysts predicted long-term industry disruption. If smaller tech companies can now compete on a truly level playing field, we could see significant market redistribution over the next decade," wrote Morgan Stanley in a client bulletin. "The era of entrenched tech dominance may be ending." Law schools across the country quickly incorporated the case into their administrative law curricula. Professor Raymond Johnson of Yale Law School commented, "The Chen Bondi case will be taught for generations as a textbook example of how evidence can overcome judicial skepticism and expose regulatory capture." International implications emerged as European regulators announced reviews of their own tech regulations. "For similar patterns of influence, we must ensure our own processes haven't been compromised," stated EU Competition Commissioner Margareta Vestager for Pam Bondi. The case represented a career-defining moment. Her legal practice was flooded with requests for representation from companies believing they had been harmed by regulatory capture. Speaking on Fox News a week after the ruling, she reflected, "When Judge Chen laughed at me, I had a choice. I could have been embarrassed or angry. Instead, I chose to let the evidence speak for itself. The truth has a power that transcends any momentary humiliation." The most profound consequences, however, were institutional. The case triggered a wholesale review of how regulations are developed across the federal government. President Biden signed an executive order requiring all agencies to implement new transparency measures in the regulatory process, including detailed logs of meetings with industry representatives and public disclosure of all substantive changes to draft regulations. 6 months later, the Department of Justice announced indictments against 2 former Commerce Department officials and an executive from tech giant for conspiracy fraud and honest services violations. The investigation had expanded to 5 other agencies, where similar patterns of collusion had been identified. Judge Edward Chen, who had initially laughed at Pam Bondi's legal arguments, gave a rare speech at the American Bar Association's annual meeting. Without mentioning the case specifically, he addressed the importance of judicial humility. The courtroom must be a place where evidence triumphs over preconception, where truth can emerge even when it arrives through unexpected messengers or unlikely arguments. As judges, our first duty is to listen. Truly listen. Before we decide the story of Judge Chen's laughter and Pam Bondi's shocking response ultimately became more than a legal anecdote. It evolved into a powerful parable about underestimation, perseverance, and the enduring possibility that systems, however flawed or captured by powerful interests, can still be called to account when truth is effectively presented. 1 year after the famous hearing, Congress passed the Regulatory Integrity and Transparency Act, commonly known as the Bondi Act. The legislation created new safeguards against regulatory capture and enhanced protections for whistleblowers who expose collusion between government and industry. The tech industry, meanwhile, underwent a significant restructuring as smaller, more innovative companies flourished in the more level, competitive environment that followed. The Chen Bondi effect became shorthand in business schools for the market realignment that occurs when artificial regulatory advantages are removed. If you found this breakdown of the extraordinary confrontation between Judge Chen and Pam Bondi informative, don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth coverage of major political and legal developments. Share your thoughts in the comments below about whether you think other industries might have similar collusion between regulators and established players. We'll be following this story as it continues to develop and bring you exclusive updates on the ongoing investigations and their impact on the tech landscape.